What's going on, guys? Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. So, as I mentioned earlier, I am going to be going over a good chunk of Shin Kamen Rider. And also, welcome to episode 1 of my section for TokuBakuhatsu. Now, before I begin, I do want to point out a few things. Number 1, there is definitely a slight difference between the manga, the show, and the film. But as I did mention in the title, the film does respect the past, gives a modern twist to a classic, and, well, to give a certain point here, if you noticed on the cover, there is a slight difference with design from manga to live action. But on top of that, some of the episodes of the show do use a few of those characters. And to go a little further into the lore, I'll first start off with the acronym SHOKKA. The original show had it stand for Sacred Hegemony of Cycle Kindred Evolutionary Realm. The Shin remake has it as Sustainable Happiness Organization with Computational Knowledge Embedded Remodeling. Now, as for the themes of the show itself, I will cover that a little later. And I will be going over little bits and pieces of the film itself. At the start of the film, we get the chase sequence with the Kumo, or as it's known in Japanese, Spider Og. It's using 2 trucks to chase down our main character, as well as his accomplice. And the minions eventually manage to capture the accomplice, bring her over to the Spider Og. But prior to blinding her, we see our main character intervene and take out the minions in a very violent fashion. Now, what's pretty clear with these Ogs is, since it's augmentation, they're not like a human. They have enhanced abilities as well as super strength. So a simple punch or a kick is amplified. And on top of that, after we go through the opening sequence, we then get introduced to Hongo, who is the main character, as is the same case with the manga. One little quick visual tidbit I want to share. When you see him remove the glove and then remove, I don't know if I would say remove, but part of the helmet or the face, in this case mask, sorry, I should have said mask. Part of the mask comes off and we see a slightly mutated, almost monster grasshopper grotesque form. This is actually a reference to the 20th anniversary of Kamen Rider. Not to confuse the two, but the main character in the 20th anniversary is known as Shin Kamen. Anyway, I'll be trying to go over this as quickly as I can, since the movie is roughly close to almost 2 hours long. I won't go over scene by scene, but at least most of it. So, Hongo meets Professor Midorikawa, and after his initial shock, the professor gives an outline to how to change back to his human form. He explains that prana is an omnipresent source of energy that sustains all life. And in a way, you can, I guess I could say, parallel this to Star Wars and the Force. If you can catch that reference, then you kind of get what is going on a little bit with this film. So the professor gives an outline in terms of how the augmented suit operates. Hongo's suit uses condensed prana to wield superhuman powers. It's also equipped with a prana absorption amplification system, which is here, of course, is connected with the belt and the mask. It also contains a converter lung, so whatever prana he absorbs gets into the converter lung, which then powers up the belt and the mask, if that makes sense. But prior to Hongo actually defeating the minions and escaping with Ruriko, the professor obviously introduces her to him, but prior to the whole thing, some of the spiders do hitch a ride on Ruriko, so by the time that they escape, they don't realize that they're being tracked. And there are some flashbacks that happen, and it reveals that Hongo had a father who was a policeman. And when he was a kid, he witnessed his father expire despite him trying to defuse the situation. And Hongo thinks that he considers himself a monster. The professor doesn't actually think so. And he points out that most of the other Augs use their power for selfish reasons. And before I go further, there's an interesting point that I have to address. So, as I mentioned, Hongo sees himself as a monster. The professor does not. And since these Augs use their power for selfish reasons, we see some of them, of course, become monstrous in nature. Now, while for some of them they're hiding behind the helmet, what is clear is that, well, they were pawns in Shokka's grand scheme of things. Anyway, we get to the explanation of the bike, which is referred to as Cyclone, tailor-made to the Batta or grasshopper hog. But anyway, the spider hog manages to track them down. He confronts Hongo and the professor. Eventually, before the professor dies, he asks Hongo to look after his daughter. And, the spider hog tells Hongo, "You shouldn't have reverted back to your human form. Big mistake." And he, of course, says that he doesn't want to fight another augmentation since he considers him an ally. But anyway, Hongo does escape, and then we get a brief replication or a remake of the same transformation sequence, but I think in the design of Cyclone, the people working on it, they went a little further in the design, which I actually like. So eventually, we get to the very first fight of the film: the Spider versus Kamen Rider. This one, we get the introduction to the rendition of the opening "Let's Go Raida Kick" from the original show, and upon further examination, I found out it's referred to as the desperate version, at least according to the original soundtrack. What we see that Kamen Rider is more of a close combat, whereas the fighting style of the Spider, he appears to be more flexible and agile. And in addition, he also has a few extra arms to grapple and strangle his opponent. What the Spider doesn't realize is he has a disadvantage. He can't fight in the air. And obviously, Kamen Rider has the edge over him. There's a few interesting visual tidbits, so one of those I'll go over right now. When you see Hongo take to the sky, you see that on the back, the grasshopper wings glow yellow. Afterwards, you see it go back to normal when he's carrying Ruriko. And the thing is, what I find fascinating is that they explain the film to prevent sensitive information from leaking out and for other, excuse me, to prevent other countries, governments, organizations, and the like from getting this information. All agents melt when they die. So Ruriko points out that the mask has a system programmed to help increase Hongo's survival instincts, despite Hongo pointing out that he doesn't want to, fight others. In a sense, it's basically a kill or be killed type of situation. Another interesting thing is that Ruriko points out that in the writing for Japanese, particularly in kanji, she points out pain and happy are almost identical when you're writing them. So eventually they do get to the safe house and they find two government agents. We then also get the explanation about Shokka, who they are, and what their objective is. Ruriko pretty much gives a pretty clear explanation. They lie about giving, pursuing happiness for mankind. Ruriko points out that it's pretty much a lie. And basically, when it comes to having them join, we find out, the notes point out that the names of these government individuals are Tobe and Jiro. So those two tried to convince them to join the anti-shocker organization, if you will. And their means of contact, I do make a point around the 23:51 to 24:25 mark. They know that Shokka can actually detect any technological messages or communication. And Ruriko's like, okay, well, we can't also have a paper trail, so how are we going to do this? And it's Jiro who points out all you gotta do to contact us, just do this. That's it. And later on, when they mention about the bat og, or as it's referred to in Japanese, kumori, that Ongo is persistent in wanting to protect Riko, but she considers his kindness, if you will, his humanity, to be a detriment. And this response gives some insight that she acts more machine than human. I'll get to that point a little later. But I'll backtrack just a tiny bit. What I find interesting with Shoka is that when Ruriko gives the lowdown, is that basically Shoka it was run by a billionaire, and the goal was to try to lead humanity to happiness. That little tidbit I will address a little later. And the thing is that the original creator was using technology and the use of artificial intelligence to try and, interpret as well. However, what Shoka is pretty much doing is that the owner assumes salvation lies in subjugation of others. Now, before I go any further on the film, I do want to point out that the irony of Shoka is, in essence, Marxism, communism, and socialism. Basically, the removal of free will of humanity, robbing people of freedom. That is the MO of Shoka. However, the interesting thing with Kamen Rider is that, yes, the previous era of writers was trying to protect happiness and freedom from this evil organization. And the interesting thing is that with one of the films later on for Kamen Rider is that we see the comparison of point of views from each generation. But I'll have to cover that some other time. Anyway, the interesting thing with the Bat Og is that prior to the fight, the scientist in this case actually inquires with Kamen Rider what has destroyed humanity the most. Hongo doesn't waste time. It's pretty easy to him. The thing that destroyed humanity the most is an epidemic. Not famine, not war. Epidemics. However, Hongo knows that Shoka and their affiliates have a twisted sense of happiness. the Bat Og actually makes a few critical errors. Number one, his ego gets to his head. Number two, the vanity or narcissism of some scientists think that just because they're so smart, that everyone else is inferior. And this type of thinking has been shown in other stories before. So I will deviate just a little bit on this as I'm going over the film, but I am going over as much of the film as I can. So to get to that point, what films, or in this case, what stories, has shown the hubris of scientists? Well, let me backtrack a little. Before Jurassic Park, we have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then we have The Invisible Man. So, what do those two stories have in common? Hubris, regardless of ethnicity, regardless if it's male or female, is going to destroy anyone, regardless. That is the critical mistake of the Bat Og. What he doesn't realize, of course, on top of that, excuse me. Anyway, what he doesn't realize is that Ruriko was playing along, and she points out that her father pretty much broke the breakdown of prana, and that despite the Bat Og and his virus experiments, that his virus has prana in it. And since Ruriko also had it, and since she knew it, she was able to rewrite it. Now, the chase sequence was pretty brief, and the Bat Og is so cocky. He thinks that, just because, he can jump, he can only reach a certain point. Again, his ego blinds him. As a result, Hongo uses Cyclone to gain more altitude, jumps off, and finishes him off with a rider kick. Something that the Bat Og obviously did not account for. Now, when we get to the Scorpion Og, this one is actually pretty quick. But this particular Og has a unique purpose in terms of plot. So, Tobei and Jiro, the unarmed government officials, they have their men actually take it out. What was not covered, though, is that they lace their bullets with the poison. And Ruriko points out that the prana system doesn't work against the venomous chemical weapons of Scorpion. So, when they go to deal with the Wasp Og, we learn that she was a former friend of Ruriko. since she was raised in the organization, she knows the majority of the players. However, despite the Wasp being as close of a friend to Ruriko, she knows that her friend is too ambitious. So it does give us, the viewer, some interesting insight to her thought process. And I just try to keep that part as brief as I can. So, despite their first attempt to try and stop her, they retreat. But there's an interesting part where Toby asks Jiro, "Are we responsible for cleaning up the mess that Hongo makes?" That part is where things get a little interesting, and I'll address that later at the end. But anyway, visually, the fight between Wasp and Kamen Rider is pretty good visually. And one of the things that surprises Hongo is that she is using these people that she's found as an experiment. She steals their prana, and in a sense, you can see that they are the drones. She is the queen, if that makes any sense. Anyway, we do get to the fight between the two, and visually, it's really good. But there's some parts of it that do remind me of something else. I'll address that later. So, Hongo spares her life, and um, the Wasp asks, "Why did you spare me?" And he goes on to explain, "I didn't want to kill you, and since you're a friend of Ruriko, I know she doesn't want that either. But since the two government agents know that she is a threat, the Wasp assumes that the gun that's pulled out is just a regular gun." And she says, "You know regular rounds are not going to work on me, right? But all that was needed was a one shot." And unfortunately, she dies, which angers and saddens Ruriko. And she looks at Jiro, who took the shot. Point blank asks him, "Is this the reason why you hunted down the scorpion hog?" And he points out, "No comment." So later on, we learn that there's another hog that was waiting in the wings. It's invisible, but what was clear when I first saw this film, there's only one creature that can do that: a chameleon. Lo and behold, I was right. So we find out that this chameleon, or referred to on the film as KK, he was a friend of Kumo, in the sense that both of them are psychotic. Anyway, we also learn that Noriko has an adoptive little brother, or just an adopted brother in general, by the name of Ichiro. And she explains to Hongo the plan of her brother: imprison humanity by stealing their prana and then transferring them over to the habitat. And the interesting thing is that both her and her brother wrote the code for it. but she intends to try and stop and reason with her brother. But unfortunately, by the time that they do confront him, they find out that he has made another grasshopper hog, number 2. And we learn that the newcomer goes by the name of Hayato Ichimonji. And despite the attempt of Hayato to stop them, Ruriko does manage to liberate Ichimonji, but not before she gets maimed in the process. How that happens is that she manages to get inside the helmet to prevent Shulker's brainwashing. But as a result, the chameleon or KK Og kills her. But the difference is that what really stopped Ichimonji was she had reprogrammed the helmet of Hongo to be put into Ichimonji. Or at least not in this case, sorry, I'm misreading it here. She transferred a code into Hongo's helmet, which would be used to stop her brother. And unfortunately, Hongo is not able to convince Ichimonji to join him. But he does ask a favor of the agents before he goes to confront Ichiro. Now, before I go any further, there is one part that I wanted to address, and that's roughly mentioned in the manga. This. Which chapter exactly am I going to be talking about? Even though I haven't read it yet, but basically, chapters 4 and 6, the titles themselves. I think what the film does address is roughly chapter 6, but visually for the squadron of the grasshopper hogs that Hongo contends with, this is where I think chapter 4, the 13, are actually addressed. And eventually Ichimonji dubs himself as Kamen Rider Nigo. He manages to save Hongo, and both eventually go to confront Ichiro. And he obviously awakened earlier as the butterfly Og, but at this point he then transforms into Kamen Rider Zero. This fight was definitely one that I found visually interesting because despite the fact that the two tried to cut off his source of energy, he's already self-sustaining at this point. And despite their best attempts, there's only one way for them to win. And that has to do with removing the helmet. but both of them are so damaged that eventually the only one that has to do it is Hongo himself. He has to remove the helmet of Ichiro, replace it with his, and he manages to do so. As a result, Ichiro manages to interact with Ruriko, and they do reconcile. But as a result, the ones that die are Hongo and Ichiro, because both of them eventually, throughout the fight, use up all of their prana. And despite the prana source being destroyed, I think it was pretty clear that Ruriko actually had a plan and a backup, because she kept telling Hongo, "Don't you know I'm always prepared for any situation?" In a sense, she was prepared. So she had one last card to play, if you will. And the difference was that prior to prior to prior to Hongo confronting Ichiro, there's a favor that was asked, basically that they needed to transfer Ruriko's soul to a safe spot. And eventually Ichimonji agrees to work with the agents and trying to stop Chakra, and they want him to carry on the mantle of Kamen Rider. So, as a result, Hongo's soul does get transferred into the helmet. So what's interesting is that the helmet was still used by Ichimonji, who is now Kamen Rider, and they refer to them now as Kamen Rider numbers 2+1. With that being covered, I can now go into the overall aspect of the film. Visually, from an objective standpoint, they did really good in respecting the film. I mean, not the film, but the source material, excuse me. And while there is a slight modern take to it, for the most part, they kept it, I guess I would say, as close as they could to the original. Now, that being said, I do have to point out a few things. The film does mention a few themes. So, what are those themes? Number one, the over-reliance of technology. Two, how would I put this? Yes. This was more on what is it to be human? What is justice? What does it mean to fight? And what does it mean to live? And one more thing I have to address. Why computers think that they know what it is to be human. that part I will answer last. But let's go over the philosophical aspects of this film. First off, we notice that Ruriko acts cold toward Hongo and his kindness and his humanity. However, there is a point in the explanation of her brother's plan is that she mentions to Hongo the only quote unquote mother type um, that I knew was in this creation chamber. This reveals that Ruriko wasn't born naturally, but was created artificially as a cyborg. Now, it's not surprising to me that Ruriko learns at the point of death to appreciate human life. She points out in her will that, you know, her best time was being with Hongo and helping him. So, in that sense, does she understand what it meant to be human compared to Kei, who is just a robot? From my observation, I would say yes. And that notion of what does it mean to be human, because emotions do define a person. But what the film also does point out is that one shouldn't just be, I wouldn't say controlled, more like possessed by it. And this is an aspect that I think gets lost with at least American artists. And I'll cover that part a little later. But anyway, since we now covered that, let's get to the next few bits. What is justice and what does it mean to fight? This is where one could say you should not confuse justice with vengeance. And when it comes to finding a reason to fight, that can vary from certain individuals. Yes, there's a mean to fight evil or fighting monsters, but in doing so, one must not become the thing that they hate or the thing that they're fighting against. This is not only mentioned with Star Wars, it has been mentioned in literature numerous times. However, modern people do not understand this. Why? It is because they forget that they make mistakes. All humans do, regardless of ethnicity, regardless if you're male or female, regardless of gender preference, regardless of religious beliefs. Everyone makes mistakes, myself included. And the thing with fighting is that it's interesting with how in this film they try to address knowing when to stop. Now, Are there some more stubborn? Yes. The wasp og was definitely stubborn. The bat og was definitely also stubborn. So was Uriko's brother. But what I found interesting is that while they were stubborn in, I guess you could say, failing to understand humanity, Ruriko was stubborn to a fault because she didn't fully understand what it was to be human. Yes, she points out to Hongo, if I hadn't intervened, those government agents that we met, they would have ended you right there. So that part, at least, it kind of showed a little bit of character development, however brief. That's just from my observation. Which now leads me to the final part that I wanted to analyze. What does it mean to live? This, I think, is something that the professor was trying to point out early on in the film. Hongo wanted to protect people, just like his father. The professor says that you wanted the power to help people. Now, while Hongo thinks that, him and his father are different, there is one thing where they're quite similar. How they protect others. Is fighting needed? Yes. But fighting to protect something or someone, that's what Hongo seems to have forgotten at first. But he then eventually points it out with Ichimonji. At least that's how I see it. With that part, I can now get to the next point that I wanted to address. Earlier, when I was showing the book, I did mention there was a couple chapters that I think the film tried to address. So, to be sure, I'll show it again. So it's actually the last chapter that I find interesting. It's because in the manga, the character mentions, I am using this mask to hide my scars. The interesting thing about the chapter called The World of Masks is that while this was actually addressed in the show, I find that there's the physical aspect of it, but most look at it too often. Some people, even myself, noticed that there's one that can't be seen, that is not physical. Now some are wondering, how is that possible? Well, if you consider what a mask functions as, you're covering something. What is being concealed? What is being hidden? It is these questions that I think sometimes this particular intellectual property tries to address. Now, earlier I did talk about technology and the problems with it. Kamen Rider is not the only story that covers this. So what other films covers it? Ghost in the Shell, Terminator, RoboCop, The Matrix, as well as I can also add artificial intelligence into the mix. So what do some of these films have in common? Well, to quote Neo from The Matrix, the machines need us and we need them. That quote was after his meeting with one of the councilmen, and that was in the second film. Now, earlier I did go over what does it mean to be human. Artificial intelligence does bring up this aspect as well. However, Kamen Rider is not the only IP that addresses this. How? Well, for any tokusatsu fan, if you have watched Kaizoku Sentai Gokaiger versus Gavan, Gavan pretty much points out to the bootleg during the fight. You may have copied my abilities and my fighting style, but you will never be able to replicate the human heart, because that is eventually what pushes Gavin through in defeating the bootleg. This is also addressed again when you have Power Rangers Super Ninja Steel, the episode Dimensions in Danger. And of course, RIP GDF. Most of us know what I'm about to say, for those of us that have watched it. But for those that have not, it's pretty much similar to what Gavin points out. Tommy points out to the robot that you're just circuits and sensors. You're nothing like me. You have no heart. Notice the parallel? That's the thing that separates man from machine. And I realized when I was listing these literary IPs, I guess, if you will, there is one film that I realized I left out. And the moment I thought about it, I'm like, it makes perfect sense. The last film I forgot to bring up that is, well, I'll put it this way, was already dead. Terminator. This film, I think, definitely brings up the whole human versus machine type thing, because this is basically what Kamen Rider is covering. A man that gets changed to machine, losing almost most of his humanity, but constantly fights the programming of a machine to help humanity and not subjugated, unlike Skynet. This, in turn, does bring up the hubris point that I mentioned earlier, not just with the Bat Hog, but with scientists in general. And to further this point, I will briefly address a classic 90s film, Jurassic Park. Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should, as quoted by Dr. Malcolm. This cannot be stressed enough, and I've said it already once. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. It doesn't matter about your ethnicity. Stupidity isn't biased, and it applies to all humans, even myself. And with that, I will go now into the general overview. Objectively, as I mentioned earlier, it does respect it. It does give any twist to it. Subjectively, I will say that they did a good job with what they had. And while I think, it could have been a little longer, I think that they covered what they needed to cover. They had enough themes of what the original tried to address. And the fact that they took the details from something this thick and got the main gist of, what needed to be said into roughly 2 hours, to me, that's impressive. So, objectively, I would give this film a 9 out of 10. Subjectively, I would say definitely a 9 out of 10. Visuals, definitely 10 out of 10 for me in this case. While I wouldn't have much to say on the music, I can't actually grade it. Story was pretty straightforward, so that one, they covered what they covered. I'm giving that at least a 9 out of 10. Character-wise, again, development as well as, how they try to portray the main characters and development, at least 8, maybe 9 out of 10. And with that being said, we have now come towards the end of this review and analysis. If you guys, like it, feel free to hit that, like button and subscribe. And with that being said, I will mention a possible film review. This is going to be the next episode, and I will try to keep you guys updated. So what I will be covering likely is one that some people have heard of but have not watched. A 90s film called Balto. Now, for those who have heard of it, great. for those that have not. I mean, I will be covering the entire film, so there will be spoilers, but I might also cover it with a non-spoiler, albeit a little bit less time, but, without the extra details. With that being said, this is Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. Hope you guys enjoyed. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay humble.